Now let's jump back in time when gaming wasn't just a hobby but a cultural revolution. A time when pixels and polygons clashed with society's expectations, where each new title seemed to push a little further against the boundaries of what was deemed acceptable. From arcade cabinets sparking moral debates, to home consoles that politicians called dangerous, these are the titles that didn't just make us fans, they made gaming an unstoppable force in pop culture. So today join me as I take a look at some of the titles that sparked plenty of controversy as well as changing the industry forever. Let's kick off with Death Race, a game so darkly fascinating it's practically the great-grandparent of video game controversy. Death Race was an arcade cabinet where players drove a car with the objective of running over gremlins that would then turn into tombstones with a macabre sound effect. For many, Death Race was their first brush with the idea that video games could influence behaviour. In fact, it was an argument that would continue decades later. Next up there was Chiller, a horror arcade game released in 1986. And it was one of those early titles that dared to push the boundaries of gore and shock. Players would control crosshairs to torture prisoners in disturbing ways, from ripping off their flesh to outright dismemberment. It's wrong on so many levels. But anyway, let's fast forward a decade and look at another title that's obviously swamped with controversy. I am of course referring to Night Trap. Being released on the Sega CD in 1992, this title was among the first games to use full motion video, featuring live actors and a story that was essentially a mix of a B-horror movie combined with a home invasion thriller. Think of it as part movie, part game, and full-on controversy. The game's campy horror style didn't seem to sit well with everyone though. Night Trap was quickly labelled as degrading and dangerous by media outlets.
Won't somebody please think of the children?
In the same year, Mortal Kombat hit arcades with a gory punch. Known for its digitised graphics as well as its realistic animations, Mortal Kombat became infamous thanks to its fatalities, where players were allowed to finish off their opponents in gruesome and creative ways. In fact, Mortal Kombat sparked outrage and was a major topic in the same hearings that surrounded Night Trap.
I was not expecting that, were you?
Anyway, when it came to the original Doom, this 1993 classic practically defined the first-person shooter genre. Doom threw players into intense action with fast-paced gunplay and horrific imagery. Doom was criticised heavily, with many claiming that it promoted violence. The game's release coincided with rising concerns about video game content and would lead to public outcry from religious groups who called it satanic. Yet despite this uproar, Doom was widely successful, with a legacy that includes inspiring countless Doom clones and proving that video games could reach new levels of immersion. Games like Hexen and Heretic were capitalised on the violent nature of Doom, taking the genre into a more fantasy style element. And speaking of horror, when it came to Phantasmagoria, it brought full motion video to the forefront of horror gaming. The story follows a woman who's become possessed, and it included graphic scenes of violence and adult themes that weren't typical in video games at the time. In fact, many stores refused to stock it, with some countries censoring it entirely. Still, it gathered a loyal horror fanbase, demonstrating the power of mature content storytelling. Moving from horror fantasy and back to the realm of racing, few games stirred up quite as much controversy in the late 90s as Carmageddon. It caused immediate outrage, particularly in places like the UK, where initial versions had to swap human pedestrians with zombies to avoid an outright ban.
It's so bad.
Another highly controversial game was Postal. Players assumed the role of a character who was on a violent rampage, often targeting civilians and law enforcement alike. Though it's banned in several countries, Postal has remained infamous. It's a title that really pushed that line. And before we bring it close to the 90s, we need to talk about Grand Theft Auto. The original GTA was a top-down open-world game that allowed players to roam a city while stealing cars and completing criminal missions. while it would take future GTA installments to cement its reputation as a controversy magnet, the original game laid the foundations. This game didn't just shock the players, it allowed them to use their imagination, sometimes in ways they shouldn't have, but it did set the stage for a global defining franchise that is still relevant today.
Oh my.
Whether they pushed the limits too far or tiptoed the edge of sanity, these games didn't just entertain, they left a mark on the industry as well as society. Now the question is, were these games just products of their time, or were they early champions of free expression in gaming? But anyway, come back next time for another amazing video. Thank you so much for watching, and see you next game.